Major League Baseball caved to fear and lies from liberal activists. They ignored the facts of our new election integrity law, and they ignored the consequences of their decision on our local community. Georgians and all Americans should know what this decision means. It means cancel culture and partisan activists are coming for your business. They're coming for your game or event in your hometown. And they're coming to cancel everything from sports to how you make a living.
All right, that was Georgia Governor Brian Kemp on Saturday, lashing out at Major League Baseball for pulling the All-Star game out of Georgia after what he calls an inaccurate characterization of a new voting law that President Biden has called Jim Crow for the 21st century. Joining us now, Executive Director and founder of the Center for Election Innovation and Research, David Becker, and co-chairs of the Poor People's Campaign and president of Repairers of the Breach, Reverend William Barber. Good to have you both on board. So, David Becker, what would be a better way to characterize this law as we move forward, if you think there would be one?
Well, I think the Georgia law and many other laws that we're seeing being proposed in the states, first of all, we have to realize they're based on a fantasy, on the big lie that the election was somehow stolen, when in fact the election in 2020 was the most secure and transparent election we've ever had, with more accurate voter lists, more auditable and recountable paper ballots than ever before, more scrutiny of the election from the media and partisan poll observers and the courts than ever before. And I think that's why the Trump DOJ, FBI, and DHS all found that the election was in fact secure. When we're looking at laws like Georgia's, where we do see some limitations on the ability to request a mail ballot, some limitations on drop boxes, criminalization of providing food and water to people waiting in line. These are really troubling. I'm even more troubled, for instance, though, by laws that we're seeing in places like Texas, which was already starting from well behind where Georgia was in 2020. It was already hard to vote in Texas. It was already one of the least secure states in which to vote, and they're making it even harder to vote and less secure.
We'll get more into that in just a moment, but first, Reverend Barber, same question to you. I mean, what would be the best way to characterize this law if you think that the messaging could be edited a bit?
Yeah, I do, because this didn't just start now. You know, this is a trend that started after 2013 with the Shelby decision. I was a leader in the effort to beat back the worst voter suppression law after the Shelby decision. It took 4 years in court and 1,200 nonviolent protesters that got arrested. And what we found out is surgical racism and surgical suppression of poor and low-wealth voters. It's about racism, but not only racism. Voter suppression is an attack on our democracy. And we have to see this because the attacks are happening in Georgia and West Virginia, in Alabama and Alaska. And I was talking the other day to a white woman and a black woman in West Virginia, and this is what they said, Mika, they just don't want us to vote. And I said, us who? And they said, the us that believes in living wages, public education, health care, corporations paying their fair share and lifting from the bottom. So we have to have a way to show how this is an attack on democracy. And you know who said this more clearly than anybody? Dr. King. At the end of the Selma to Montgomery March, he said that every time there is a threat of the Negro and black masses to vote, you end up with this attempt to suppress the vote. And that's why we have to remember in this last election, 55% of poor and low-wealth voters voted for Biden-Harris, and 6 million more poor and low-wealth voters this time than in 2016. This is voter suppression, it's surgical racism and surgical suppression. It's not just racism alone.
David, as you say, there's been so much focus on the state of Georgia and all the controversy swirling there with Major League Baseball moving its All-Star game from Atlanta to Denver. But there's a lot going on across the country, and you're focused in on Texas and SB 7. What does that bill do?
So first of all, Texas started out as one of the states where it was hardest to request a mail ballot. You needed an excuse. It was hard to vote early. It's one of the few states that doesn't require paper ballots that can be audited and recounted, like we saw in Georgia, where the presidential ballots were counted 3 separate times, 3 separate ways. So it started out well behind many of the other states, and this law would make it even harder. It makes it difficult for local officials to try to make it easier for people to vote, as we saw in places like Harris County, Texas in 2020, where ingenious local officials tried to find ways to facilitate democracy, even in the face of the pandemic and Texas's already restrictive laws. So, for instance, it makes it very difficult to drop your ballot off. One of the things that really troubles me, if you have a disability, which is one of the few reasons you can use to request a mail ballot, you now need to actually get a note from your doctor before you go out and are able to request a mail ballot. It also empowers partisan poll watchers, and only partisan poll watchers, to go into the polling places, to basically roam wherever they want, possibly interfering with the process, and video voters as they're voting if they think something is fishy going on. In comparison, even the Georgia law says you can't do that. So this is actually unprecedented. It's something I'm really watching in Texas. The Texas House is now considering this bill, and we're going to have to see what happens.
David, what's the rationale given in Texas and in these states with all the restriction we've seen? What we've heard in Georgia is from Governor Kemp, we have to secure the elections. Now, as we pointed out every time we talk about this story, court after court after court stood up in the challenges to the election process and said, no, it was free and fair. Election security experts like Chris Krebs have said it was the most secure election in the history of our country. So what are we hearing from lawmakers proposing these laws?
Well, we hear the same claims of needing to secure the election, claims of election integrity. But the simple fact is we have never had more secure elections in the United States than we do now. We're going to need to continue to build on security over time, but we're doing a really good job of that. You know, for instance, one of the things that's a consensus recommendation that Georgia accepted and put in place for the first time in 2020 was paper ballots that could be audited and recounted. It was the first time in 2 decades that Georgia offered paper ballots statewide. Texas is one of the last states to have paper ballots statewide. And in fact, SB 7 in Texas would delay the rollout of paper ballots till 2026, making Texas likely the only state in the 2024 presidential election that doesn't have paper ballots.
Reverend Barber, Mike Barnacle's here with a question for you. Mike?
Oh, Mike, good morning.
Reverend, as you know, arguably there are 42 or 43 states all involved in voting laws, new voting laws on the books, studying new voting laws on the books. My question to you is, in Georgia and all of the rest of the states, including Texas that David was just talking about, is there there's been an effort in the media at some point in the past couple of weeks to sort of try and be even-handed in their approach and their coverage of specifically the Georgia law, saying, well, it's not quite as bad or as repressive as we first thought. So my question to you is, in Georgia and in all of the other states that you're covering in terms of these new potential voter laws, do any of them make voting easier, or do all of them make voting just a little bit harder for specific groups of people?
It's interesting. None of them make it easier. All of them make it harder. And any attempt to abridge the right to vote. We forget the 15th Amendment says you cannot not just deny the right, but abridge the right to vote. So what we should be doing is expanding. When we fought in North Carolina and won, by the way, they wanted to roll back same-day registration and early voting. What we are seeing is every attempt to suppress the vote, but it's surgical. It's surgical because they know they just need small percentages. And one of the things that we're saying in this moment, maybe we ought to call it Jim Crow Esquire, not just Jim Crow, because even if you say Jim Crow, you need to explain it's not just about black people. But what I think we need to do in this moment is that any attempt to suppress the vote is wrong. Now, in Georgia, people are calling on corporations to task, and that's right. But I want to suggest that what corporations really ought to do is stop backing the senators across this nation who have filibustered restoring the Voting Rights Act for 2,844 days today. Because if the Voting Rights Act was in place, none of these laws would make it through pre-clearance. We need that bill, the John Lewis bill, now. We needed to grandfather all these laws that are being pushed, and they need to be pre-cleared now. So what we need is litigation, we need this legislation, and we need corporations to stop supporting these senators that are filibustering, fixing the Voting Rights Act. It is atrocious that today in America we have less voting rights than we had in August of 1965 when the Voting Rights Act was first passed, because the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and gutted Section 5 in 2013. This will not just be won in state by state. It's a federal problem. We need federal laws. We need the litigation. And by the way, the litigation is going to have to do hard work to prove the surgical racism. It's not just going to be obvious. There's got to be a lot of data done to prove that it's surgical racism and surgical suppression of the disabled, women, young people, and so forth and so on, and the poor.
Reverend William Barber and David Becker, thank you both very much for coming on the show this morning. We appreciate it.
Hey, thanks so much for watching our YouTube channel. You can follow up on today's top stories and breaking news, or catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.